A group of friends gathered in front of the enormous Target store. The night air was heavy with anticipation. Its enormous red logo towered over us like a colossal sentinel of consumerism. We had heard tales of strange things happening there after dark, so we wanted to see if the stories were real or not. Mark's face was beaming with the joyous anticipation of the game.
All right, guys, it's time for hide and seek.
We went in and hid for an hour until Target closed. Then we returned from our hiding spot at the vegetable section. We drew straws to determine who would be it, to a chorus of cheers. It turned out to be Lisa. While the rest of us hurried into the dim store, she groaned amusingly and started counting. I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I slid into a clothes rack near the entrance. The store's eerie silence reminded me of a forgotten cemetery for consumer desires as the dimly lit aisles stretched out in front of me. After a few minutes, the excitement gave way to growing discomfort. I scanned the empty racks and shivered as I did so. As she counted, Lisa's voice, now anxious, reverberated throughout the shop. I heard something suddenly, voices in the dark, echoing faintly in the distance. The voices sounded like they were coming from the shadows further inside the store, so I tried to focus my ears. I muttered to the others hiding nearby.
Guys, you hear that?
With wide-eyed uncertainty, they nodded.
It's likely just in our minds,
Mark murmured.
Let's wait until Lisa locates us.
Despite our agreement, we kept a vigilant eye out for any movement in the aisles while keeping our flashlights ready. The strange noises persisted while the game went on. It seemed as though the store's very walls were whispering things we shouldn't have heard. Like a chorus of phantoms, the voices grew louder and more difficult to understand. Then, the lights started to flutter. It started out subtly, like a momentary dimming, but it soon became more noticeable. As the store gradually went dark, one section at a time, fear spread throughout the group.
Guys, where are you?
Lisa yelled, her voice trembling. When we pointed our lights in the direction of her voice, we caught a glimpse of her silhouette standing by herself in the pitch-black void. The rumbling became louder. We were caught in a nightmare rather than just playing a game. We heard footsteps coming toward us as we made an effort to regroup. As impossible moving shadows darted between the aisles, panic set in. Our flashlights were pointed in the direction of the sounds, but nothing was there. Nothing but empty aisles and the gloomy darkness. I hissed,
Lisa, we have to get out of here.
But before we could act, a ragged figure with torn clothing and wide eyes crept out of the shadows. They screamed at us, their voices a mix of rage and desperation. The figure snarled,
Get out! Get out now!
We then realized we weren't the only ones experiencing this nightmare. Other figures could be seen emerging from the shadows, all looking equally frightened and disheveled. They were homeless individuals who had taken refuge in this closed Target. We all let out a scream of terror as we stumbled to our feet while clutching our flashlights with trembling hands. Now that they could be seen more clearly, the faces of the homeless people were etched with fear and desperation. The man who had initially approached us kept yelling,
Get out now!
We ran as fast as we could toward the far-off glow of an emergency exit sign amid the ensuing chaos. We pushed forward, our hearts pounding and our breaths quickening. With her fear-fueled tenacity, Lisa, who had previously been it, was now urging us forward. We rushed through the doors into the chilly night air as we approached the emergency exit. We staggered out of the building while gasping for air and collapsed on the sidewalk. The homeless people dispersed into the shadows and vanished into the night, their faces still marked with fear. We sat there, frightened and perplexed, attempting to make sense of the terrifying experience. Working the late shift at Target was never particularly exciting. I restocked shelves while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, trying to break the eerie silence that had descended upon the shop. Few lingering patrons, most of whom appeared to prefer being somewhere else, were the only customers left as it was well after midnight. At some point, a strange person entered the store. He's not strange because he stood out in the dimly lit store, but because there was something eerie about him. He caught my attention right away. He moved in an unnaturally stiff manner, much like a life-sized mannequin. His appearance was unkempt, and greasy strands of hair hung around his face, but his eyes, which were gloomy and vacant, like empty pits, were what really caught my attention. In the hopes that he would simply grab what he required and depart, I nodded politely to him before returning to my work. Yet he didn't. He picked up items at random and placed them in the wrong places as he rambled aimlessly through the aisles. He appeared to be searching without knowing what he was looking for. As I restocked the canned goods aisle, I kept a look out of the corner of my eye to watch him. He chose a carton of eggs in the end and proceeded to the checkout counter where I was working. He came closer, and I could see the deep lines that had been etched into his face, as though he had aged a lifetime in a matter of minutes. I calculated the cost of his carton of eggs after scanning it. Before handing me a crumpled wad of cash, he fumbled around in his pockets for a short while. He leaned closer while his hot, foul breath was on my neck as I counted his change.
You know, I used to have a family,
he murmured, his voice barely audible above a whisper.
A wife and children. However, they are no longer here.
He caught my eye as my unease grew. I had no idea how to respond to such a statement because this wasn't the appropriate setting or time for personal confessions. I attempted to smile politely while giving him his change in the hopes that he would get the message and walk away. Though he didn't. He stayed there, staring at me with those soulless eyes. He asked in a low, helpless voice,
Have you ever lost someone, kid? Have you ever had the impression that you were by yourself?
Since I wasn't sure what to say, I remained silent. To be honest, all I wanted was for him to pay and leave, but he seemed determined to involve me in his pain. Along with my job, he started asking me about my family and personal life. By giving him evasive answers in the hopes that he would get the point, I made an effort to brush him off. He continued, though, and he kept asking intrusive questions. Where I lived, whether I was alone, and whether I ever felt lonely were all things he was curious about. Panic nibbled at the edges of my demeanor, but I tried to keep my composure and shut him down. He told me I was a good kid. He paid for his eggs and added that I looked happy, and no one can take that away from me. I fought the urge to smile, glad that he was finally going away. I finished his transaction while observing him leave through the automatic doors and vanish into the deserted parking lot. I sighed with relief, hoping I had seen him for good. I completed my closing responsibilities and made my way to the employee parking lot. Long shadows were created by the store's harsh exterior lights on this chilly, dark night. I fumbled for my keys and cautiously walked to my car. I had the sense that I was being watched, which was probably just in my head. I quickly locked the doors after climbing inside the unlocked car. When I saw him in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. At the far end of the parking lot, there he was, his eyes fixed on mine in the pitch blackness. As I inserted the key into the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot with my tires screeching on the concrete, fear coiled in my chest. I didn't turn around because I didn't want to see if he was pursuing me. I simply continued to drive, my heart racing, until I arrived at the security of my apartment. As I called the police to report the odd encounter, I locked the door behind me with shaking hands. They said they'd send a patrol car to look things over, but they never located him. I had the impression that he was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting and watching, for weeks after that. I never stayed at Target for another late shift, and I always kept a weary eye out for strangers. I've never been able to figure out what happened that evening, but I'll never forget the strange and troubled patron who made an ordinary evening into a terrifying ordeal. Even though I don't typically shake in my boots, that day at Target had me drenched in sweat. I imagined it would be just another typical shopping trip, to pick up some groceries and perhaps a pair of discounted shoes. However, there was something about that man that just didn't feel right to me. I strolled down the aisles, loading my cart with the usual items like vegetables and other things to cook. And there he was, hiding behind those clothing racks, waiting to pounce on his prey like some kind of predator. My stomach clenched like a knot, but I shook it off because I reasoned that it might have been my imagination. But as I walked down the next aisle, I suddenly felt his eyes piercing at the back of my head. I justified my actions by blaming my paranoia on watching too many crime shows, but you can't get rid of that uneasy sensation, that prickling sensation in the back of your neck that you're being watched. So I continued and got the shampoo, cereal, and other things I needed while this guy followed me behind like a shadow. I was drenched in sweat by the time I reached the cash register. The cashier gave me a strange look, as if she knew something that I didn't. I swiped my card, bagged my belongings, and quickly moved toward the exit. I had to shake this man quickly. My heart sank like a stone as I went outside, though. He was standing there, leaning against a battered pickup truck, pretending to check his phone. I walked quickly to my car while keeping my head down, hoping he wouldn't follow. But when I turned to check my rearview mirror, his truck was directly behind me, tailgating recklessly. I accelerated hard and made a sharp turn onto the following street, but when I made another turn, he stayed right on my tail, so perhaps he was simply headed in the same direction by coincidence. An unwelcome chill of panic began to spread. I kept making more turns in an attempt to lose him in the maze of suburban streets, but he was unrelenting. This man had the stubbornness of a bad penny. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel as fear was eating away at me. After a while, desperation overcame me, and I began to consider the nearby police station. I had to try something, even though it was a long shot. In hopes that the guy wouldn't notice, I sped up to it. I felt relief wash over me like a warm shower after a difficult day as I parked my car in the police station's parking lot. As soon as I had parked, I practically leaped out of my car and into the street. When I turned around, I was expecting to see him standing there. However, he had pulled up behind me, his face twisted in an angry mask. With my heart racing, I ran towards the police station's entrance. I could hear my own raging, labored breathing. I was shielded from whatever this guy had in mind by the glass door, which served as a fortress. I plowed into it, forced the door open, and stumbled inside. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up from her desk with concern written all over her face.
"Can I assist you, dear?"
I rambled on and told her about the man who had pursued me since Target. She nodded as she quickly typed a report before I had time to blink. She did so while continuing to scan the video feed from the security cameras.
"He's still out there,"
she said in a low, serious voice.
"However, don't be concerned. We'll deal with this."
I felt a little bit of hope. I was at last being taken seriously. The front desk agent then developed a ghostly pallor. I overheard her whisper something into the radio she had on her desk. The sound of tires squealing and an engine revving. As I hurried to the window, my stomach dropped into my throat. That same person was standing there, flying out of the parking lot like a bat out of hell. Like he had left me a parting gift, panic began to claw at me once more. With her eyes wide with fear, the receptionist looked at me.
"He's gone. but we have his license plate number. I'll guarantee that we'll find him.
I nodded despite being deeply uneasy. After saying my goodbyes and thanking her, I walked shakily back to my car from the police station. The memory of those icy, predatory eyes would follow me for a very long time, even though that man may have disappeared for the moment. I couldn't help but wonder what had set him off and why, out of everyone at the store, he had chosen to target me as I was driving home. But one thing was for certain. I would be watching my back for a while because sometimes monsters don't only exist in fiction. They are actually watching you when you least expect it, and they are real.